Now that gave me some goose pimples, if anything ever did. Hey, guys, thank you so much for joining us here today. I am so excited to be here with you guys this morning. And normally, this is the part of the service where the preacher talks a little bit about the bumper video. So I want to keep with the tradition, and I want to do that liberty for myself here today. But in order to talk about this one, I need to talk about the last bumper video. So I know Pastor Evan said it was the last time we were ever going to talk about the bumper video a couple weeks ago, but I promise this time is the last time we're going to talk about the old bumper video. I just have some stuff on my chest right now. I just got to get it out of there, and just so you guys know from me. But if you weren't with us earlier, we've been working through a series before this one called The Baptizer. All right, and The Baptizer, in the bumper video, I got to star in it, and I was running through the forest as John the Baptist running to the river. And I felt like during the bumper video, I was getting a little bit too much credit considering all the other work that went into the video. I kept every single week, people kept coming up to me. They kept saying, oh, were you wearing shoes or were you not wearing shoes? Which, by the way, I'm gonna take that with me to the grave. So unfortunately, no one's ever gonna know the secret to that one. I also had people every week, they likened me running through the forest, that of a gazelle, frolicking through the forest, which, by the way, I prefer the term Mustang over gazelle. It's just so you guys know for next time, but you can't win them all, I guess. But I felt like every week people were saying these things to me. There was so much more that went into the bumper video. There was Pastor Evan that was there, just giving vision, just bleeding the vision as he does so well over the bumper video and what he wanted it to look like. There was my friend Moses Lee who was there. He was filming everything, making sure the transitions were nice, making sure I was looking good as I was running through the forest. And I was so happy when I saw this new bumper video that Moses is finally getting the recognition that he deserves, splitting the Red Sea in this goose pimple worthy bumper video, which is just so amazing. So congratulations to Moses on that one. But guys, again, so happy to be here with you guys today. If I haven't got the chance to meet you yet, my name is Joshua. I am the high school coordinator here at Northgate. And I just gotta say, I am so happy to be part of this church. It's just such a privilege to grow and to thrive here at this church. And I just gotta say, last week, Pastor Rob shouted out the Next Gen team, and I wanna shout out the pastoral team today. So just a couple weeks ago, I was talking to some of the pastoral team, and we were talking about how I've been on staff, and many of the other staff as well have been on staff more during COVID than outside of COVID. And it's just this crazy thing, because when you think of something like that, normally you'd think that we'd get to witness a dying church. We get to witness a church that isn't doing too great or isn't doing too well. But I've actually seen the opposite of that since I've been here. I haven't seen the church dying. I've seen the church thriving since I've been able to be here. And it's just been such an amazing experience watching our pastoral team lead with such wisdom and such great decision making during this time. So wherever you're at today, can we give a big round of applause and emoji down in the comments for our pastoral team just doing an amazing job here. But guys, as you know, we are in this sermon series called Exodus. All right, we've been talking all about the life of Moses, who's this character in the Bible that has this crazy story. He has this amazing story from the time he was born all the way and he grows up and takes on the call that God has for his life. And if you haven't been here for the last couple weeks, it's this story that starts out with Pharaoh enslaving the Israelite people. He starts to notice they start getting a little bit too powerful for the way that he would like to see things. So what he decides to do, he decides to kill all of the male children of the Israelite people. And in the first week, we learned that Jochebed, the mother of Moses, in order to save her son, sent Moses down the Nile in order to save him, which, by the way, under most circumstances is a terrible idea, yet she thinks this is the way that Moses is going to be saved. So she sends him down the river, and it turns out he does get saved. He ends up washing into Pharaoh's palace, where he grows up as a prince of Egypt. He was a Hebrew, but yet he was a prince of Egypt. And he lived many years of his life in this affluence, in this influence that he would have had as a prince of Egypt. Until one day, he made a mistake. One day he sees one of his fellow Israelite or Hebrew brothers. They're just getting destroyed by one of these Egyptian people. So he decides he's gonna take salvation into his own hands. He decides that he's the one that's gonna bring salvation to the Israelite people in and of himself. So what he does, he goes and confronts this Egyptian and he ends up killing them. And out of fear, Moses runs all the way into the desert, into the wilderness, and where he spends many years of his life, where he gets a wife, he has some kids. And one day, as we learned last week, he was shepherding, and God came and spoke to him. And when God spoke to him, God told him that he was sending him back to Egypt. Probably that one place he probably thought he would never have to go again. Probably that one place that wasn't really high on his list to have to go back to. And that was the exact place that God was calling him back to in order to bring salvation to the Israelite people. And we see that Moses, in this moment, he doubts himself, as many of us do. When God's calling us in different ways, he doubts himself. But God says to Moses, I will be with you. So Moses goes back to Egypt. And this time, he's gonna bring salvation, but not by his own hand. Not in and of his own power, but by the hand of God. And where we're gonna pick up the story today is when Moses has just come back to Egypt. He's gathered together the Israelite elders. He's letting them know what's going to happen. It says all of them believed what he was gonna say. So him and Aaron, one of his relatives, is gonna be his spokesperson while he's there in Egypt. They go and confront Pharaoh, who probably, by the way, is one of the most powerful people in the entire world right now. One of the most powerful civilizations that we've ever seen as a human race, Moses, who we learned last week, was at best a nobody, and at worst, a murderer, is standing in front of the most powerful person in the world. And he is about to make an outrageous request to Pharaoh. And that's what we're gonna start reading today from Exodus chapter 5, verse 1. And this is what it says. It says, afterward, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel says, let my people go, so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness. Pharaoh said, who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go. So what we see here is Moses makes this outrageous request to Pharaoh, the most powerful person in the entire world. The equivalent of what Moses is basically saying to the Pharaoh right now. He's basically saying, hey Pharaoh, you know all that workforce that you have? You know the backs of the people that built this economy, that made it to what it is today? Yeah, I want you to let all of them go right now. Not a very convincing argument. If you're a business owner out there, somebody walks into your business tomorrow, they're dressed in a robe, they have a really big, straggly beard, maybe they got a staff. You know, they don't talk, they get their friend to talk for them because they can't talk very well. And this person says, let my people go. What are you gonna do? You're gonna say no. Like, this is just an outrageous request that Moses makes. And the question we're all asking ourselves when we're reading this story is how Moses can do this. If we remember earlier in the story, Moses ran away from Egypt. Moses ran away in Egypt in fear when he killed the Egyptian. And if he was scared then, he should probably be scared now that he's asking the most powerful person in the world, the one person that could just say he wants him killed and just kill him right there on the spot, but yet he doesn't have any fear. And even earlier in the story, Moses doubts himself. He's like, God, I can't go. I can't speak properly. God, I can't go. You must send someone else. And he's doubting himself, yet we see him standing in front of Pharaoh now. And how is he able to do this? If he had fear before, why does he not have fear anymore? And the answer to that question is that he does have fear. That the salvation of Israel is going to come through fear. But it's no longer a fear of Pharaoh. It's no longer a fear of man, but now it is a fear of God. And now we gotta talk about the fear of God a little bit, because when we hear fear of God, it can cause a lot of ideas to pop up into our head about what that actually means. You might be sitting at home right now and you're just thinking of all the things that you're afraid of or all the things you fear. Maybe for you, you fear dogs, which I mean, fair enough. I'm not one to judge you on that one. Maybe for you, you fear holding babies, which again, No judgment from me. Totally get that. And you're thinking of all these different things, spiders, whatever it is, all of these different things maybe that you fear, but yet we read in the Bible that God is a relational God. That God wants to have an intimate relationship with us. And you might be asking yourself, well, how can I have an intimate relationship with somebody that I'm scared of or somebody that I'm afraid of? And the truth we come to see is that the fear of God isn't rooted in these negative attributes of what we would see fear as. But that the fear of God isn't just merely being scared of God, but that the fear of God is rooted in this reverence for God. This awe-inspiring reverence of who God is, this deep-rooted respect, this deep knowledge, this deep knowing of who God truly is. And that is what the fear of the Lord is. And this is what Moses is displaying in his life. Because he now fears God, that gives him confidence in other aspects of his life. Because he fears who God is and knows who God is and knows what God has called him to do, it doesn't matter what anyone else has to say. It doesn't matter what anyone else in Egypt is saying to him right now, because he's now following God, because his fear of God eradicated the fear of everything else in his life. And I know that this whole topic of fear, with fearing one thing, can oftentimes lead to confidence in another area of our life. It's something that I learned from a very early age. I remember when I was still in school, there was this thing that we did every single week during math class called a math minute, all right? So if you've done a math minute before, let us know in the comments, but I used to love math minutes. And if you don't know what a math minute is, basically, it's a bunch of math questions, and you have a minute to fill out as many math questions as you can. And I'm a pretty competitive person, so I would always try to do it as fast as I can during that 1 minute. And not to toot my own horn, but I'm a big adding and multiplication kind of guy. I feel pretty confident in my adding and multiplication skills, and I was doing pretty good at my math minutes. I was feeling good about myself until one day they introduced this thing called long division. All right? So they introduced long division, and I don't even know why they bothered calling it long division, because it's just long. It's just long. It's just not a fun process to be a part of whatsoever. But they introduced long division. I just couldn't get it. I couldn't understand what was going on. I remember I'll get all my questions wrong. My math minute crown fell off my head, and it was just not a good time. I remember I went home, and I went to my dad, who's the math guy in our house. And I was sitting there, I was telling him about this, and he showed me this new method on how to do long division. And all of a sudden, everything just clicked. It was that light bulb moment. I was like, oh, that's how you do it. And I finally am doing all these questions right. He's got the calculator up, but I'm doing it faster than the calculator now. I'm just writing down all of these different questions, and I finished my work, and I am so excited to hand it in the next day. I'm so excited to give this to my teacher. So I grab my math minute sheet. I bring it into my teacher with this smile. I got a little strut in my step. I'm feeling good. I'm going up to my teacher, and I go to hand her my math minute, head held high. I give it to her when she makes this noise. Now, I don't care what you're doing. You never want to hear at any point. It's never a good thing. It never translates into a good thing. So she says this, and I'm sitting there like, oh no. Like, what did I do? What could I have possibly done wrong? So I give it to her, and she says, Joshua, you got all of these questions right. And I was like, oh, okay, perfect, awesome. Like, great, I'm feeling good again. But she says, but this is actually the old way of doing math. We actually don't do math like this anymore. So unfortunately, I'm gonna have to get you to redo this in the new way of doing math. And I remember in the moment, I was fuming. I was like, I just spent 3 weeks being terrible at math minutes, and I finally understand how to do division. And you're telling me I'm doing it wrong because my method wasn't up to standard, or it wasn't up to your standard? And I remember in my head, I'm just saying all this stuff like, I don't have to listen to you. You're not my mom. You're not my dad. I'm gonna do math like this for the rest of my life, and you can't say anything about it. And I was really dramatic when I was younger, and I was just saying all these things in my head, and I learned something very important that day. The thing that I learned was that we serve what we fear. That we serve what we fear. So since I had more respect for my dad, I had more awe for my dad. I had more reverence for my dad or fear for my dad. It made me want to serve what he was telling me to do and not my teacher, because I learned that we serve what we fear. So in our lives, there's these different things that we serve, and normally when we look at the things we serve, we can find the thing that we fear. Maybe for you fear money. Money's the thing you fear. Probably a lot of your life is just based around serving money, doing all you can to get money, all you can to make sure if it's the highest priority to you, that's what you're gonna do, that's what you're gonna serve. Maybe it's Instagram. That's the thing that you fear. You're gonna do everything that you can to make sure that you get enough followers, make sure you get enough social media clout. You're gonna do all that you can to make sure you can do all of these different things because we serve what we fear. And we see in the life of Moses, now that Moses fears God, he now serves God. He no longer serves man. He serves what God is telling him to do. So he's going, making this outrageous request to Pharaoh with confidence. And this wasn't always the case for Moses. As we learned in the first week, Moses has tried salvation before. He's tried to save the Israelite people before, but he thought it was gonna take a man to do this. We can see that he feared men because he thought it was gonna be a man that was gonna bring salvation. It was gonna be a man that was gonna save the Israelite people. But the truth he came to find as he started to fear God, but that salvation was never gonna come through Moses. That salvation was never gonna come through Moses alone. That salvation was gonna come when he feared God and allowed God to work through him. And that's how the salvation of the Israelite people was going to happen. And we see that Pharaoh doesn't have this fear. Pharaoh isn't really on the same page as Moses. We see this contrast between these two characters of Moses and Pharaoh. Someone that fears God, Moses, and someone that probably just fears himself, Pharaoh. And we even see it in verse 2 when it says, Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord that I should obey him? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." So Pharaoh refuses to fear God. He refuses Moses because he doesn't fear God. And what we see is that every time Pharaoh says no to letting the Israelite people go, we start to see these plagues that start to happen. And there's a bunch of different plagues that we begin to see during this story. We're not gonna hop into all of them today, but there's a lot of different ones. The Nile turns to blood. There's all these frogs, all these gnats, all these flies, all the livestock starts to die. There's darkness. There's all of these different terrible things that begin to happen to the Egyptian people. And one can look at these plagues and wonder why God would do that. Like, could not God not just snap his finger and the Egyptians just would cease to exist on the planet? And what we come to see is that the purpose of the plagues wasn't just to destroy the Egyptian people. The purpose of the plagues wasn't so God could get revenge on the Egyptian people for what they did to his people, but that the purpose of the plagues was so that they would fear God. That until Pharaoh learned how to fear God, he would not be able to let the Israelite people go. Someone once said that to fear God means to submit to his authority. And this was the purpose of the plagues, that until he gets to that point, that he's not gonna be able to submit to the authority of God. And we start to see this pattern in the plagues. So a plague would happen, flies would come, it would just ravage the land of Egypt, and Pharaoh would call Moses to him and beg Moses, like, Moses, pray to your God, please take these flies away. Please take this plague away from us. And Moses would say, of course I'll pray. Of course I'll pray to my God, but you have to let my people go. And Pharaoh would say, of course, obviously I'm gonna let your people go. Of course, that's the thing that I'm gonna do. And Pharaoh would be like, all right with letting these people go. But what we come to see is every single time the plague was taken away, it says that Pharaoh's heart was hardened and he would not let the Israelite people go. So as soon as that reminder of the greatness of God, as soon as that reminder of God's presence in Pharaoh's life was gone, he forgot and he wasn't able to fear God. And how often do we forget who God is in our lives? How easy is it to forget what God has done in and through our lives? You may be thinking of times where God was just so present to you during maybe your salvation moment, maybe a time later in your life during a service or during a camp, whatever it was, just during these times in a service where you felt God so closely. Maybe it was a time where God provided for your family when it didn't look like he was gonna provide. Maybe it was a time you didn't have enough money to pay for something and God provided and you just felt God so closely, and we're so thankful for who God was in those moments. But then a week goes by, a few weeks go by, a couple months go by, and then we begin to forget who God was. When that physical manifestation of God or seeing God in that way move is gone from us, it's so easy for us to forget. And we're gonna see in the life of Pharaoh that and many times as he forgets, that the plagues just keep coming and coming and coming until he's able to get to a point where he truly fears God. So we get to the point of the 7th plague. 7 times this process has repeated itself, and we get to the 7th plague. And God is now speaking to Moses to say this thing to Pharaoh. And this is what God says before the plague happens for Moses to tell Pharaoh. He says, "For by now I could have put out my hand and struck you and your people with pestilence, and you would have been cut off from the earth. But for this purpose I have raised you up, to show you my power, so that my name may be proclaimed in all the earth. You are still exalting yourself against my people and will not let them go." It says that Pharaoh was still exalting himself against the Israelite people. And the more that he exalted himself, the more that he thought more of himself, the less he was able to fear God and the less he was able to let the Israelite people go. So this plague happens. It's a plague of hail and rain and thunder. There's these massive hailstones that end up falling upon the Egyptian people. And it says in the word, it says that those of you who fear God, make sure you bring in your livestock. Make sure you bring in your slaves, because otherwise they're gonna die. And we start to see the people that feared God submitted to his authority, and they brought in all of their livestock. But the people that didn't, the hail came upon them, and all this stuff starts happening. The hail's coming down, people are dying, and Pharaoh again calls Moses to him and begs him, "Moses, please take this plague away from us." And Moses is like, "Yes, of course, I'll take this plague away, but you have to let my people go." And again, Pharaoh says, of course I will let your people go." So Moses prays. The hail stops, and we see the pattern happen again. In verse 34, it says, "But when Pharaoh saw that the rain and the hail and the thunder had ceased," as soon as he saw that physical reminder of God in his life was gone, he sinned yet again and hardened his heart, he and his servants. As I said, the more Pharaoh exalted himself, the more he wasn't able to see or fear God in his life. And we recently learned in the last sermon series, the baptizer, that John the Baptist, who Jesus said himself is the greatest man to ever walk the face of the planet, that John the Baptist says, "He must increase and I must decrease." John understood that his greatness didn't come from himself. He understood that it didn't come from his own power, but the only way he could be considered great, the only way he could be considered powerful was through the power of God working through him. That as he decreased himself, God was able to work all the more through him. Another person in the Bible by the name of Paul, one of the greatest theological minds to ever walk the face of the planet, says in the book of Romans in chapter 12, "Do not think of yourself more highly than you ought." And he goes to list all of these spiritual giftings. He says, if you want to be considered powerful, if you want God to move through you, if you want to bring salvation, the only way that's going to happen is if you don't think of yourself more highly than you ought. The only way that's going to happen is if you decrease yourself in your life. And we see this in the life of Moses as well. As I was preparing for this sermon, I had to watch the Prince of Egypt movie. And if you haven't seen it, make sure after this you go and check out the movie. But there was this really powerful scene in the movie. It was right after Moses had just killed the Egyptian, and now he's running off into the desert out of fear, trying to escape from Pharaoh. And there's this moment where he's wearing all of this jewelry from Egypt. He's wearing all of these things that would have considered him or made people know that he was a prince of Egypt. And we just see him in this moment of desperation. He falls to his knees and he just strips off all of these things that people would have known him as, strips off all of these pieces of jewelry that people would have looked at him and known that he was a son or someone in Pharaoh's court. He just strips off all of these things, and it signifies Moses truly becoming a nobody. And then many years go by, and then that's when God calls him. And I find it really interesting that God decides to use him after he's stripped off all of his influence, after he's stripped off all of his power. That when Moses was a prince of Egypt, you would think that God would want to use him then. When he had this influence, when he had this power, when he had all of these things going for him, he could work from the inside in, from the court of Pharaoh. Would it not make sense for Moses to be used during that time? But we come to see that God didn't want to use a prince of Egypt. God wanted to use a nobody. That the only way that God's power could truly be moved through him, the only way that Israel was going to find salvation was when Moses decreased himself. That the more that Moses decreased, the more God's power was able to be made more known through him. God doesn't need your Instagram followers. He doesn't need your job position. He doesn't need your area of affluence. All he needs is you. He works in our lack. He works when we're not enough. He works in those moments when we don't feel like we have enough to offer. That's when God moves. We don't have to wait until we get to this certain point of social security or this certain point of social affluence, but that God uses us where we are at. No matter how young, no matter how old we are, that God has a plan and he has a purpose. If we would only allow ourselves to think less of ourselves and allow God's power to move through us in those ways. And you know, I think this is why Jesus told us to have childlike faith. Jesus talks about how to truly have faith, it should be a faith like a child's. And we look in the life of children, how when a child is born and when a child is really young, I know for myself, my parents could have told me anything. My parents could have said the most outrageous thing to me, and I would have believed them. I would have believed every word that they would have said to me. But as I got a little bit older, as I started to get a little bit more influence, get a little bit more knowledge, and think a little bit more of myself, I found I often didn't listen as much to maybe what my parents were telling me, or didn't always take what my parents' opinion on something was. That the older that we get, that sometimes we can lose that reverence for God. That when we have that moment of salvation, it's so easy to say yes to God. It's so easy for us to follow God's way, but as soon as we think more of ourselves, as soon as we start exalting ourselves, as soon as maybe that reminder of who God was in our lives begins to dwindle in our minds, it becomes harder for us to remember who God is and to fear God within our lives. So 2 points I want to leave you guys here with today before we close for today. The first one is that we serve what we fear. That we serve what we fear. We see the two characters in this story of Moses and Pharaoh. How Pharaoh feared man and how Moses feared God. And we're going to see later on in the story in the coming weeks who ends up coming out on top. Who ends up truly being powerful in the end, whether it was the person that feared God or the person that feared man. We're gonna see the person that feared God advance more in their lives because of that fear that he has. Because all of us, no matter if you would call yourself a Christian, whether you'd call yourself a skeptic, whether you'd call yourself kind of a Christian or not really sure, or maybe you're questioning things right now, no matter where you find yourself today, we all fear something. We all have reverence for something in our life. We all have this deep respect for something in our lives. And when we find out what that is, it'll be a good indicator of what we serve. It'll be a good indicator about where we're at. And I will tell you right now, every time I get the opportunity to stand here and tell you, I will tell you that fearing God is the true way that we find power, is the true way that we find the fulfillment and the call of our lives. But ultimately, that's a decision you have to come to on your own. So I want you to ask yourself, what do you fear? What are the things in your life that are driving you, your motivations, and things that are carrying you in different ways? And the second point is that as a people, we're to look to the promiser not the promised. That we look to the promiser, not the promised. You know, I find it very odd that when Moses comes to Pharaoh and he tells the Israelites what he's gonna do, he says, let my people go so we can go to a festival in the wilderness. The Israelite people would have grown up probably knowing about a promised land, how there was a God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and about this promised land that God had promised to them, a land flowing with milk and honey, this land that they were going to inherit as a people. They would have grown up knowing this story and knowing what that meant for them in their lives. Yet Moses, when he's coming to bring salvation to them, says, we're going into the wilderness for a festival. And what we begin to see in that moment is that Moses wanted to point them to the promiser, not the promised. That Moses didn't find God or find this power, find the calling for his life when he had affluence, when he had influence, when he probably thought he was in the promised place that he was supposed to go, that he found God in the wilderness. He found God when he thought less of himself, that he found God in these different moments. It wasn't until he thought less of himself that he entered into the promised thing that God had called him to do. So as a people, we need to look to the promiser, not the promised. It's so easy to look to the promised things right now. All of us, we all talk about revival. That's something that we want. We talk about at the very least meeting in person again and how nice that would be. And those things are amazing and something that we should want. But we need to look to the promiser of those promises and not the promised things or the tangible things in our lives that we want. We need to look first to God before we look to these other things in our lives. Because I am sure we will meet again. I believe that we will see a revival on this island. I believe that we're gonna see the Spirit move in some amazing ways, but I also believe that if we don't first look to God, if we don't first look to the promiser, as Moses did, that we're not gonna be able to see that. So it's so important that we first look to the promiser and not the promised. So it's so easy to remember that we need to remember that we serve what we fear, and we need to look to the promiser and not the promised. Let's pray together before we close. God, thank you so much for your promises. Thank you so much for the life of Moses, God, how you guided his life, how you shaped his life, God, how you shaped him from this person of affluence. You shaped him from this person that had all of this influence over so many people. You shaped him from that moment, and it wasn't until he thought less of himself. It wasn't until he diminished as a person that we get to see his power and salvation move through him. God, thank you, you're a good God. Thank you for every single person tuning in right now. God, I pray you just deepen our fear of you, God. You just deepen our reverence of you in our hearts, God, that even now, Lord, even now, reveal the things in our hearts that we fear more than you. Reveal the things in our lives that we put at a higher stake in our lives than you. God, I pray you just reveal that to us, that just like Moses, God, that we would be able to recognize those things, God, that you just continue to build in this church, God, build in your people, God, a reverence of you, God. And we know, God, that as we look to you, as we come alongside you, as we continue to follow you in our lives, God, we believe we're gonna see the promised things, God, that you promise us in your word, God. But God, I pray we would first be a people that come to the promiser and not the promised first, God. That you would just continue to move, God, and you continue to be in each of our hearts, God. That you would work out those things in our hearts, God. You would strip us of pride, God. You would strip us of everything, God, that's holding us back from knowing you in a deeper way, God. That we would just know deeply in our hearts, God, that you are the one we look to. You are the one we fear. You are the one we serve, Lord. And that we would just continue to look to you with everything in our hearts and in our lives, Jesus. God, we love you, and we are so excited for the move that we're gonna see in this valley, in this island, in this world, God, when your people first look to you. So God, we trust you and we thank you for everything and all that you've done for us. And we pray this all in Jesus' name, amen.